Valentine's Day. Did you get your Valentine anything?
Brian Little.
Japan.
Hey everyone, it's Pastor Robbie, and it is good to be back in our Purple Void after a week away. We have been on the road since Wednesday, heading back from northern Washington. We got back safely, and it looks like we just kind of missed the storm of the century as we were coming down, right? So that's nice. But as we always say, nice to be away, but it's always way nicer to be back in town. It would be even nicer, right, if we were saying all this in the sanctuary together rather than on this video this morning. But that's not all. Sannin Failak, right? So I hope that you've been able to celebrate Chinese New Year in some fashion so far. We were on the road on Friday, so we're kind of sadly, we've been ordering some Chinese food here and there as we've been able to. Very much different than what we normally would have done, right? Harry Fong reminded us last Tuesday that it was about a year ago this time, right, that we celebrated Chinese New Year's as the church family is prone to do, right, at our annual luncheon. And just like what a memory and what a thing to kind of miss out on as part of our rhythm. But this is our current rhythm. And today, it's time to take a look at the closing of one season and the start of a new season. Today is the final Sunday of the season of the Epiphany, which means that this Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and it's the start of the season of Lent. For those who would be following the gospel election, today is Transfiguration Sunday, right? But for us, as we've been going through the Old Testament, we're looking at one of the folks who showed up during the Transfiguration. We're looking at the prophet Elijah. It's actually an important passage in which we see Elijah's ascension into heaven and then the passing of the mantle from Elijah to Elisha. It holds messages for us about discipleship, about listening and responding in faith. But stick around and we'll get to it. But before we get to the scripture, I want to try something new today. Usually at this point in the videos, I'd start asking you to subscribe to the channel, right? But I looked at some of the background information, and it looks like more or less most of the people who watch these videos are already subscribed to the channel. So let's try and see if we can do something else, right? For this video, what I want you to do is I want you to click the thumbs up button, right? Like that's one of those buttons that's down there by the subscribe button. Let's see if we can get this video up to, say, 15 likes, right? And just see if that changes how many people are able to view this video, right? I think that if we get a few more than the normal 2 to 4 thumbs up, right? Like maybe our video might actually make it out to a few more folks. And so while you're doing that, hitting the thumbs up, hitting subscribe if you still need to, right? Let's just take in the words from today's scripture. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know. Be silent." And then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they were both standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I'm being taken from you, it will be granted. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, the chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended into a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I remember my dad preaching this passage when I was younger, little kid, I guess. Dad had a thing for taking some of these people from the Old Testament and then really building them up into serious, honorable figures. He did a series of sermons on Joshua, right? And those messages really helped me form my image of faithfulness in those days that came after Moses. He did a series of sermons for David, and they helped me, I think, understand calling and how God still used leaders despite the imperfections of some leaders like David. If I were to encapsulate Dad's messages during those times, it would probably be that imperfect people were capable of demonstrating incredible faithfulness. Now, in my own journey, my own explorations of the Old Testament scriptures, particularly over the past 2 or 3 years, I would say that my conclusions are a bit different than Dad's. I really wrestle to preach David in the same way that my dad preaches David because of the context of who David was and what he did in life, and particularly what he did with power. We always come back to that phrase about David's identity as the man after God's own heart. But the reality is that David was a kind of like severely flawed person who gets a lot of credit late in life for things that the Lord did early in his life. Like you almost have to separate David's life into 2, maybe even 3 different eras to really grasp who he is. I think if we thought about it in 2 groups, right? It would be like David's pre-king days and then the days after he was elevated to the throne. Like those are 2 different people. And when I preach David, I really wrestle to unsee that difference. Another figure that Dad elevated in his preaching was the prophet Elijah from our passage today. Here we find more common ground in our preaching because I've developed kind of an affinity for the prophets, especially as we think about our role in discipleship as people who listen to the Father, right? The prophets have always given us these great examples of like how to listen and to speak in the midst of the most difficult circumstances, right? Like if I wanted to drag David a little bit more here, I'd talk about the prophet Nathan, who laid out all of David's sin before him, right? Like Nathan walked into the seat of power and exposed the sexual and the ethical sin of the most powerful person in Jerusalem. The prophets give us those kinds of examples, right? Like how we listen to and how we follow the voice of God when we know there will be a cost to our listening and to our following. And Elijah was no exception. Elijah was the prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel at a particularly tumultuous time. He was the prophet, the contemporary of King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And the conflict that existed there between Elijah and Ahab was probably only slightly less vicious between the two of them than the conflict that existed between Elijah and Jezebel. You know, like famously, Jezebel sought to diminish the worship of Yahweh in favor of the gods from her homeland. And as the worship of Baal increased, the priests and the prophets of Yahweh were increasingly sought out, murdered. The culmination of their interaction came when Elijah called out the prophets of Jezebel, or the Jezebel and the prophets of Baal, rather, to prove the power of their God by calling down fire onto a sacrifice. Famous passage from Scripture here. When they couldn't do so, Elijah then called on Yahweh to do the same thing, to bring fire to their sacrifice, and along with a ton of water. He put all this water on there, right? And in response to that prayer, the sacrifice was consumed. You know, Elijah spent much of his life on the run from this famous first couple, but he was always the one to be outspoken about the word and the will of Yahweh. Our passage today holds one of those moments that is of significance, both in the biblical record and then for me as a listener of my dad's sermons, right? For the biblical record, we read this passage on this day because of the way that it connects us with the transfiguration from the New Testament. When Jesus is transfigured, shining brightly, right? Two people are suddenly standing with him, and they are people of great significance in the history of Israel. One of them, Moses, and the other is the prophet Elijah. Elijah is present with Jesus in part because of the way that he's taken up to heaven, and in part because of the way his word was always true to the voice of the Father when so many had perished or fallen away. When I was a kid, I remember this passage because of something that happens at the very end of this, right? The passing of the mantle. Our passage kind of cuts off right as Elijah is taken up into heaven, but there's a significant thing that's at work here that carries forward the encouragement we read from Moses just a few weeks ago. Hopefully you recall that passage, right, where Moses was really concerned with the people's ability to follow a new leader or a new prophet so that his words were words of preparation for that day they would have to listen to another deliver the words of the Father to guide them. In this passage, Elijah knows what's about to happen. In this passage, Elisha knows what's about to happen, right? And I kind of laughed as I read through the passage again, because apparently in this passage, everybody knows what's about to happen to Elijah. And because of that, there's like this big unspoken question that's floating out there. And that's, once Elijah's gone, who takes his position? See, this time with King Ahab and Jezebel, like things were pretty rough for the people who worshipped Yahweh in Israel. There was another prophet, Obadiah, who happened to be in the king's court. And if it weren't for Obadiah, there would have been, no one to protect the people of God. As such, Obadiah provided the people of Yahweh like caves to hide in when Jezebel was on her mission to eradicate the worship of Yahweh. People weren't really sticking their heads out to be noticed as a prophet of the Lord because that tended to be a death sentence. So when Elijah called out the prophets of Baal, he kind of became the man that everyone else followed. So when he was walking to the Jordan and everybody knew that the Lord was about to sweep him up, they were all kind of wondering who would come next. And that's where Elisha enters the conversation. Elisha was a protege of Elijah's. He had followed and he'd learned from the older master. He's kind of a big deal, which makes it a little bit strange that this moment when Elijah is walking up for his ascension, it's really only the second time that we hear about him. The other time is 1 Kings 19. We hear about him, and he's named to be Elijah's successor. But then beyond that, there just isn't a lot of background on Elisha. He hasn't become the obvious successor to anybody other than Yahweh and Elijah. Now, as all good listeners do, Elisha listened to, but then ignored Elijah's command in this passage twice. He was told twice to wait behind, and the answer was always no. Elisha had no intention of leaving his master behind to allow him to do this one thing on his own, which really tells us a lot about Elisha. You know, Elisha had been around the block a few times with Elijah, and he knew the voice of his master. He knew that voice so well that he was able to determine when the voice was saying something that's not really at the heart of what the master wants. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want to drink a soda. But even in saying that, you guys all know that I want to drink a soda. Like, I could clobber a Dr. Pepper right now. Like, it's late now. I know that I'm shooting this, right? I could do it right now. That's like the difference between, say, like Ashley and my kids. You know, like, they all know my voice, but my kids don't know, like, the nuance in the words that I say the way that Ashley does. When I'm having a tough day, like, she knows that something that's going to pick me up a little bit, sugary boost, right? Like, she's there for me. Elisha has been with Elijah long enough to know that, let me go ahead on my own, isn't like an absolute demand from the master. He knows that his place is next to his master, and no one is going to move him from that place. He's listening to the voice, but then he's obeying the heart of the master's words. Now, eventually they come to the place where everyone else falls behind. They come to the Jordan River. And Elijah does something, like he takes his mantle. It kind of would have been like an outside cloak for his outfit. Takes it, he rolls it up, and then hits the water with it. And at this action, the waters of the Jordan part. And for those who are back and they're watching, they get what's happening, right? Like, if you part water, God's with you, period, right? Like, end of story. Happened at the Red Sea. It happened multiple times here at this river, right? Like, if the water parts, Yahweh is with you. And so when they see this, they know that the Lord is with Elijah as he walks across the Jordan with Elisha. Now, after some conversation, Elisha makes his big ask of Elijah, right? He asks that he would inherit a double share of Elijah's spirit when he's taken up. And it's a big ask. Even Elijah's not really sure about it, but Elijah concedes to the request. And after some time, you know, it's the whole fiery horse chariot from heaven scooping up Elijah and carrying him off, and then Elisha is left on his own. Right, cue the music. All by myself, right? Elisha is alone. Like, there wasn't a moment where Elijah spoke a great word, or like his spirit magically passed on into Elisha. It's just Elisha alone and grieving this loss. And once he's finished with the mourning, right, the tearing of his clothes, he just gathers his things back and he gets ready to head back. However, there's one thing there that's not his, and it's the mantle of Elijah. You get goosebumps a little bit, right? Like, it's something of significance sitting right at his feet. And so he scoops it up. He heads back towards Jericho. And this is what I always appreciated from Dad's sermons. Like, he kind of set the scene here. Elisha is returning to the Jordan River, and he's feeling alone. No Elijah, no magic moment, right, of the Lord establishing himself, or Elisha, as the prophet. He's alone, right? But then as the river comes into view, he realizes he's not totally alone, right? On the other side of the river, there's a small group of people, right? Small, but a significant group of people. That group of people are the other prophets of Israel who had also followed Elijah that far, right? Like, they were there for a purpose. They have an expectation in this moment. What they want to see if Elisha has been given the gift of Elijah, and they want to know if this will be the one that they can then follow, right? Can you feel the moment a little bit? Like, it becomes tense as everybody begins to realize what's supposed to happen next. The prophets look at Elisha and they have a hope and they have an expectancy there. And Elisha is looking back, probably just afraid that he's going to let them down. Except that he has this one thing from Elijah. This is the one thing that was the last thing that all of those people on the other side of the river saw. Elijah used to part the water, the mantle. So Elijah rolls it up and prays, and just kind of like on a side note, I low-key kind of love the prayer here. It's kind of like, oh, where are you, God? I hope you're here. All right, like it's always like, let's see if this works. And he takes that rolled up mantle and he strikes the water, and he watches as the waters part again for the prophet of the Lord, Elisha. Now, there's a lot in this passage, man. Like we can make it a call back to, Moses encouraging the people to hear the voice of the Father from somebody else. We can make it all about succession of identity and how important it is for you to be following another while also leading others in the way of the cross. We can make it about how there will always be folks on the other side of the river looking at us and the example that we carry with us, right? Like all of these things exist in this passage. But this is, I think, what I wonder. Like if you were able to write the end of this sermon, and you were going to share the story of Scripture with another, what do you imagine you would tell them, right? Like, what would you say? That's the end of this message, but I want you to do something. I want you to take a moment and think about how you would end this message. And then just leave it in a comment down below. Let us know what you think the Lord is saying to all of us today through this passage.